Hello and welcome back to News of the Week. This week I want to make you aware of something that really came to me through several interviews and conversations with other folks. One of them was basically as an interview for our podcast, but also a couple of other conversations that all revolved around what is currently the state of landlording, if you want to, or property management or anything along those lines. And what is kind of interesting that organizations who focus on residential real estate, especially when it is a little bit bigger, like multifamily apartment complexes, how do they actually find properties in both our space, 1 to 4 units, as well as bigger spaces and bigger properties, and why do they find them? And what I find interesting, and this is something for us to keep in mind as we look at how we invest and where we invest going forward, that there is a growing number of people who own properties, individual properties all the way to apartment complexes, that they purchased or got involved with 20, 30, even 35 years ago when they were younger, when they were basically focusing on that and not necessarily being able to only do that. So if they were like smaller operators, they are not really full-time, full-size, large-scale property management organizations, but more like private individuals or families. So oftentimes they needed to have other income or keep their job or so forth, and then have the property on the side. Or somebody in the family originally did the property management and then it got inherited, or any of those kind of circumstances. And what is kind of interesting, what comes out of that is that there seems to be a generational shift going on right now, where people who thought there is a huge promise in investing in real estate to actually getting passive income out of it, has in some cases not really necessarily been completely fulfilled. And the question for me was, well, what happened there? What is the reason? And two things really came mainly out of the conversations. One reason is that you kind of need to stay with your properties and the state of your properties and have something in place, either through property management or a turnkey provider, or if you're doing it yourself, so that you constantly can say, my property is in good shape, is technically up to date, so that the value of the property is not deteriorating because there is deferred maintenance. So that's the one aspect. The other aspect that I find also quite interesting is what has actually happened in that current generation of smaller personal or family operators in that space. And one person on one of our podcast interviews really put it very nicely together. He said, if you think about it, if somebody bought into a property or a group of properties or an apartment complex 20 years ago, so that would be 2003. That brings up the question, what has actually happened in that time since? And what we're finding is in 2008 to 10 or 11, that person, if they survived it, went through the great financial crisis. One of the things that happened there was that property values really came down. So the promise of, okay, I get invested and I have appreciation didn't necessarily come true. The second thing that happened in those several years in a row, that people got hit so badly that a lot of them just left the properties, or if they stayed in the property, they just didn't pay rent. And if you tried to evict them, well, you could evict them, but then you had an empty property because nobody else was actually physically and economically able to get into the property and pay proper rent. So then you recovered from that if you actually made it through. Remember, we bought in 2003, so now here we are 2012, 13, 14. You're finally getting into a phase where you can actually get rent as you had planned. You can kind of recover, you can kind of replenish reserves, but in that time frame, appreciation is almost not happening. there wasn't a whole lot of appreciation in the real estate market up until about 2018, 2019. And when you thought, oh, finally, my properties are starting to appreciate, and you saw all these, 100 people lining up to buy a house or stuff like that in 2019, 2020, and you were getting kind of like excited again about your purchases and your properties, and you may have by that time quite a bit of deferred maintenance. Now you're getting into a situation with COVID where for 2 years, or in some cases more than 2 years, people were in your property. If they didn't pay, you couldn't evict them, so you had no income, but the property was still expected to be maintained. And when the eviction bans were finally lifted, you had a huge backlog of unpaid rent that you probably never really going to recover. So those two big events, the pandemic about 10 years after the big financial crisis, and anybody who made it through that has probably gotten somewhat frustrated and burned by these events. Now, I'm not saying this to say, well, our whole promise and our whole system of long-term investing in real estate doesn't work. But what it really indicates and educates us is the opposite. Our strategy is dependent on having either proper property management, a professional organization who does that, who has systems, who is engaged with the tenants, who keeps the properties up to date, who is in touch with us to make sure that there is very little to no deferred maintenance. And the other aspect is that we get ourselves in a position where we're basically facilitating home ownership and living in properties without necessarily being completely responsible for every little thing that happens in a property. So those are some of the things that I thought were fascinating this week, and I want to ask you to think about it. Now, the one thing, we had our September powwow, and I want to ask you for your help again. Please think about who do you know in your network who would like to participate and help people to get into home ownership. So please let me know, please get in touch. I have created a 20-page document that I can now make available if anybody is interested. So please go to idealwealthgrower.com and book a call and let me know that you want to help me or know people who want to help me so that we can get the ball rolling on that aspect. With that being said, be well, stay safe, and I see you in the next one.